the camera. You give it off, give it off, give it. Hello everyone, I'm Alex Navarro and welcome to a skin-peelingly painful edition of Here's What You Missed here on Screen.com. This is, of course, where we, the editors of Screen, typically tend to go out of our way to inform you on the rich, textured fiction of some major film franchise or TV series, in the hopes of getting you up to speed on the latest sequel, remake, reboot, or whatever else might be coming down the increasingly filth-encrusted Hollywood pipes. That said, today's entry is a tad different. I am in fact going to be getting you ready for a new sequel in a franchise that I personally hold very near and dear to my heart. But that upcoming sequel, let's just say, well, its prospects ain't looking so good.
You have a darkness that rivals my own, Nico. It will be a very special pleasure to rip you apart.
Hellraiser has been both the high watermark for creatively gripping gore and a poor, destitute laughingstock of the genre, thanks in no small part to the endless rights-mongering of the Weinstein Company. Over the last several years, the producers in control of the name have produced a number of straw man sequels made cheaply and ineptly for the exclusive purpose of ensuring Harvey Weinstein's control of the series' rights. The last of these sequels, Revelations, has had horror fans both laughing hysterically and banging heads on keyboards at the sheer depressing truth of what Hellraiser has become. I mean, dear God, just look at this thing.
Yes. Can we get a shot of downtown LA before we say goodbye to it forever?
Bye, LA!
This is gonna be an epic journey.
Here we go.
While Revelations does not look to be anything worth celebrating, some of the earlier Hellraiser films are still movies that any horror enthusiast can and should enjoy. But with such a veritable minefield of garbage out there featuring the name Hellraiser plastered on it, navigating said field may prove a tad difficult. So consider this my instructional lesson on which Hellraisers to watch and which to avoid. I'll skip any huge story-ending spoilers wherever possible, though honestly, the twists and turns of these plots is less the issue at hand here. You go into a Hellraiser movie more for the atmosphere, the gore, and the presence of perennial series antagonist Pinhead, played dutifully by British actor Doug Bradley.
Demons to some, angels to others.
So with that, let's take a look at a few of the series highlights and briefly touch on some of the series' lowlights so that you may be spared your own personal hell. This whole Hellraiser thing kicked off with one of Barker's trademark novellas, a story called The Hellbound Heart. It told the tale of Frank, a nihilistic pleasure seeker who, seemingly insatiable in his desire to get his rocks off in increasingly dangerous ways, discovers a mystical puzzle box called the Lament Configuration. This box purportedly unlocks a doorway to a dimension of infinite pleasures, but in truth, it's a bit more insidious than that. Rather, it opens a gateway to a dimension of pure chaos, pure torture, and pure evil. This dimension has something of a sadomasochistic bent with creatures called Cenobites, led by the appropriately named Pinhead, who inflict eternal suffering on anyone who falls into their grasp, under the belief that pain and pleasure are essentially interchangeable.
No. You solved the box. We came. Now you must come with us. Taste our pleasures.
Unsurprisingly, Frank has a bit of regret over this whole thing, and over the course of the story attempts to re-enter our world at the behest of his former lover, and current wife of his brother, Julia. Through circumstances too weird and too gross to explain in any real detail here, Frank is essentially resurrected as a skinless, emaciated corpse who can only come fully back to life by absorbing the flesh of hapless victims, which Julia happily brings to him. Frank's niece, Kirsty, figures out that something's amiss with her evil stepmother, though inexplicably it isn't via any horrible smell in the attic, and finds herself in possession of the aforementioned puzzle box, which then sets the Cenobites on her trail as well.
No! Give it to me.
She promises them Frank, conflict ensues, and let's just say things get a little messy. The original Hellraiser film, written and directed by Barker, mostly stays true to this story and its various elements. The sadomasochistic elements are maybe a little bit more generalized in the film. Pinhead and his cohorts certainly have the whole Leather Masters thing going on. And the Cenobites in their realm are generally more alluded to as like demons from hell, by whatever definition you want to give it. However, those changes do very little to tone down the violence and gore inherent to the story. In 1987, Hellraiser was something of a revelation among horror enthusiasts, both grotesque and enrapturing with its portrayals of death, dismemberment, and God, so much skin ripping. Jesus Christ.
Jesus wept.
Looking back at the movie now, it all, of course, seems like a little bit cheesy, but as most films of the era tend to. But Barker's direction is enrapturing, even for such a meager budget and with such antiquated filmmaking technology. More importantly, Bradley's performance as the pitiless pain merchant Pinhead immediately established the character as one of the great terrors of the era. Bradley, much like Robert Englund, never really escaped the shadow of this one iconic character. But given his willingness to don the leather gear and scalp-piercing pins time and time again, one can surmise that he probably didn't really mind that much.
Don't do that!
Go to hell!
Though Hellbound Hellraiser 2 looked every bit like a quickie, cheapo cash-in sequel when released in 1988, a new director and screenwriter came on to tackle the project, though Barker remained a producer and story-credited writer. Hellbound is in some ways actually superior to the original, though also inferior in others. Following the continuing tale of Kirsty following the terrifying events at her father's former home, she is now in the hands of Dr. Chenard, an almost assuredly evil neurosurgeon and psychiatrist who runs a totally not evil-looking mental hospital. Seriously, why are mental health professionals almost always super evil in movies?
Clearly, there is much we must discuss, much we must investigate.
Kirsty does meet one nice guy, an underling doctor named Kyle, who takes a shine to the poor girl in her suffering. She also meets Tiffany, a mute patient of the hospital who, fascinatingly enough, has a penchant for solving puzzles. Gee, you think that might come into play at some point? Right around the time Kirsty starts having horrible visions of her father crying out for help from hell, we learn that Dr. Chenard is up to some seriously no good shit. Acquiring the mattress that Kirsty's stepmom bidded on, Chenard figures out how to raise the skinless, angry spirit of Julia from the dead. Much as Frank did in the first film, Julia needs flesh to become whole again, a need Chenard is more than happy to indulge her in for both the sake of seeming infatuation with her, and also an unrelenting desire to know what lies beyond.
I have such sights to show you.
That desire pulls Kirsty and Tiffany into hell, and a whole lot of trouble with those pesky Cenobites. Hellbound's best and worst quality is the film's delving deeper into the realm of the Cenobites. The idea of exploring this labyrinth of people's personal hells is actually pretty awesome and gruesome, though the highly limited special effects lead to a number of moments that belie the grand scale the director is clearly going for. The gore is ratcheted up, but the scope of the film is well beyond the budget's grasp, leading to more chuckle-worthy moments than perhaps anyone likely intended. Still, Hellbound is a vital piece of Hellraiser's fiction, especially as we learn more about the Cenobites and how they came to be.
I remember.
You were all human.
That revelation is both a tad tragic, yet a perfect denouement for the Hellraiser storyline, at least insofar as it deals with Kirsty's trials and travails.
Tiffany.
Now, here's where things start getting a little bit dicier.
Ready for your close-up, Joey?
The brains behind all things Hellraiser did at least have the good sense to wait a few years to make Hellraiser 3 Hell on Earth. Though by that point, Clive Barker's involvement had become tangential at best, and despite attempting to tell a somewhat interesting story, ineptitude on all fronts permeated much of Hell on Earth's production. Starring Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Becker star Terry Farrell as an Anchorman-esque female reporter fighting sexism and injustice wherever she can find it.
This may be a surprise to you, Brad, but I want to do this the right way. Tight stories, not tight skirts.
Farrell stumbles upon the story of a lifetime when, while trolling the hospital circuit, apparently these are the sorts of things LA news reporters do, she stumbles upon a kid wheeled in with mysterious-looking chains attached to his skin that, well, let's just watch. Understandably concerned about what's transpired here, Farrell goes hunting for the source of these murderous chains, which lead back to a club called, in appropriately early 90s fashion, the Boiler Room.
Excuse me?
Run by J.P. Monroe, a smarmy chucklehead who looks like he wandered in out of a Bret Easton Ellis novel, it turns out that the chains emanated from, drumroll please, the Lament configuration. In this case, it's found its way into Monroe's possession via creepy-ass sculpture, which some people may remember from the end of Hellraiser 2.
is your pleasure, sir?
Turns out it's alive! Sort of. It actually houses the pure, torturous id of Pinhead, who has split off from his former human personality. Without that human side to add a bit of restraint to his goals, he's now hell-bent on creating a new hell on Earth. One that Farrell, through a lot of shrieking and crying mostly, has to try to avert with the help of Pinhead's human spirit, a World War I veteran who, much like Frank and Dr. Chenard, once found the puzzle box himself.
Opening the box, my final act of exploration.
It's actually kind of a neat story that is sadly mishandled from the word go. Farrell is a stiff, lifeless presence that often seems about as terrified as your average mannequin, and the supporting cast is just... wow.
Bitch.
Also, while the idea of hell on Earth is appropriately horrifying, and seems prime for all sorts of just nasty, ungodly stuff following this particularly great massacre scene in the middle of the club. Once Pinhead starts fashioning hasty Cenobites out of whatever spare parts he has lying around, Hellraiser pretty much just goes from potentially fascinating to just plain laughable.
Shit! Gasoline!
By the time Farrell is trapped in bondage gear while human and demon Pinhead start sussing out their issues in hilariously goofy fashion, you've pretty much checked out of this thing altogether. Surprisingly, things do take a slight turn for the positive in 1996's Hellraiser Bloodline. Now, generally speaking, there are two distinct moments in any horror series where you can tell the franchise has completely jumped the mutilated, skinless shark. When they do an In the Hood installment, or when they go to fucking space. Hellraiser Bloodline goes to space, and yet despite that completely absurd detail, is actually not an awful movie. In fact, it's actually reasonably creepy and kind of fascinating.
I'm playing the endgame here, Rimmer. Finishing something that began centuries ago, and I don't have the time to help you understand.
Bloodline is a bit of a time-spanning tale, spinning a story about the origins of the lament configuration. Specifically, it's the story of the Merchant Clan, all the way back to 18th century France, where a young toy maker is tasked with creating a puzzle box for a wealthy aristocrat who happens to be obsessed with the dark arts.
Are you brilliant?
Finest toy maker in France.
We learn this tale from the descendant of the toy maker hundreds of years in the future on a goddamn space station. He explains in excruciating detail the history of his family to a sort of spacefaring federal agent played by that one actress everyone gets when Terry Hatcher isn't available. We learn of how the aristocrat used the lament configuration to unleash and control a demon. This demon, played as a sort of bloodthirsty sexpot by Valentina Vargas, of course kills the aristocrat at the behest of his former protege, and then when the toy maker comes to try to stop what's been happening, kills him too. Ah, but the bloodline lives on. Flash forward to the era of the billowy button-up shirts and floppy forehead-length hair known as the mid-90s, and we meet another descendant of the toy maker, an obsessive architect whose designs seem to strangely mirror that of the puzzle box. Without getting too far into it, he meets up again with the Demon Lady, and along the way comes Pinhead and the Cenobites, once again looking to traipse back into our world to wreak havoc on all of our souls.
I can smell the exquisite stench of what you really are.
Eventually, the three storylines do reasonably tie themselves up, and along the way, plenty of people die awful, violent deaths that are decidedly less cheesy than anything in the last movie. Bloodline mostly manages to hold your attention with some fairly competent scripting and performances that don't appear made up entirely of amateur hour dinner theater cast-offs. That the film's original director, Kevin Yeager, all but disowned Bloodline to his own desire for a more violent imagery is actually kind of interesting, considering this is easily the best of the Hellraiser movies past the 1980s. And now comes for the steep, deadly fall, the plunge into the abyss from which the Hellraiser franchise never, ever recovered. Once the series dug itself into a direct-to-video rut with 2000's Hellraiser Inferno, it never even bothered trying to dig itself out again. Oddly enough, it also decided at this point to turn Pinhead into less of an overarching antagonist and more of like a bit player in the film's stories.
I am not the killer.
A sort of looming presence that really only pops in from time to time to inform people that, yes, they're going to keep right on suffering. In Inferno, he eventually tells that to a crooked cop who finds himself in possession of the puzzle box while attempting to solve a series of grisly murders. Inferno actually offers the least screen time for Pinhead in any of the movie series, and also dials back the gore significantly, cutting away from most of the really violent stuff. It attempts to be sort of a psychological thriller, and at best, it's sort of a limp attempt at that. Also, sorry, but Hellraiser without Pinhead might as well just not be Hellraiser at all.
Oh my god. Oh god.
What's the matter, Joe? You okay? What's the matter? Joe! No! Don't do it!
In 2002, we got Hellraiser Hellseeker, and also the return of Kirsty, now a married woman, albeit married to an absolute cad who cheats on her regularly. That shitbag husband has himself an accident early in the film, and the state leaves him sort of fuzzy on the difference between fantasy and reality. That is, of course, until Pinhead comes along to show him the truth of who he is and was.
Let me help you remember.
Rather than try to, better himself, he instead tries to make Kirsty reopen the lament configuration to save his own neck.
Open it up.
I trusted you. I trusted you. God damn it. How could you do this to us?
Instead, she double deals him, offering Pinhead the souls of her husband's mistresses and conspiratorial friends in exchange for her escape.
What if I make you a deal?
Interesting.
I will bring you 5 souls in exchange for mine.
The big twist ending is very much in the vein of the kind of cheesy, ridiculous shit often seen in early 2000s horror movies, though this has the added bonus of barely making a lick of sense on top of everything else. In 2005, we got not one, but 2 films bearing the moniker of Hellraiser. In Hellraiser Deader, no, seriously, that was the subtitle, Deader. Hellraiser Deader. Kari Wurr, that great former VJ and great actress of such quality films as Anaconda and a bunch of direct-to-video prophecy sequels, plays a reporter sent to Bucharest to investigate a dark cult, who, of course, are playing around with the puzzle box. As with most films starring Kari Wurr, Deader is fucking awful. A mess of a movie that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever and is about as thrilling as, well, your average trip to Bucharest. Somehow even worse is Hellraiser Hellworld, a movie that takes advantage of the mid-2000s obsession with video games as a gateway to real-life horror. With Lance Henriksen as the father of a kid who kills himself due to an overwhelming addiction to an MMO based on the Hellraiser series.
Welcome, Hellraiser.
He lures a bunch of his son's friends to a house to torture and kill them all Jigsaw style until eventually revealing that, hey, Pinhead's actually kind of real. Because, fuck, I don't know, dude. Want to know how bad this movie is? Just look at how thrilled Lance Henriksen is to be here. With that, we come to 2011 and the eventual release of Revelations, which, incidentally, is the first Hellraiser movie to not even feature Doug Bradley as Pinhead, which tells you just about how good this thing is going to be. So where does that leave you, the would-be viewer? By all means, you should absolutely watch the first 2 Hellraiser films, and I actually do think that the 4th one, again, despite the whole space thing, is worth a watch as well.
I know you're watching.
Hellraiser 3 is a bad movie, perhaps worth watching once, if only for the hilarity factor, but anything past Bloodline is best left ignored, if not completely vilified.
There is no returning. And are you willing to pay the price?
As it happens, every single Hellraiser movie ever made is on Netflix Instant Watch right now, so if you really feel like marathoning this stuff, you could. But again, by the time you get to Inferno, you'll be on a downward spiral the likes of which no human soul could possibly survive.
Your nightmare is just about to begin.
See you in hell. How's that for a wake-up call?
Hopefully this tour through Hellraiser's hellish labyrinth has been informative and entertaining for you. By all means, comment away with your thoughts on the series and your feelings on the various films. I'd love to see if people actually have the same tolerance for Hellraiser 4 that I do. Once again, I've been Alex Navarre reminding you that when homeless transients offer you shiny trinkets, decline the offer. For the love of God, decline the offer.
What's your pleasure, sir?